Okay, well, our program looks on paper quite a bit like a regular executive MBA program. So it's intended for mature professionals. It takes place over 2.5 years. The people in the program are working the whole time that they study in almost all instances. Um, but that's sort of where the parallel ends. Um, if you look at our coursework, 80% of the classes look like a regular MBA program, but there are a few courses that are totally different. So we have a course called Philosophy of Management, which I teach, which looks at the worldviews and the values of Indigenous people and the worldviews and values that underlie social science. So most of the content that they're going to be studying in the program is social science content. And so it's really important that they understand what the assumptions and what the values are that inform the development of the social sciences and be able to think critically about how Indigenous values interact with the values that guided the development of social science. So that's one course that is quite different. Most people don't study that in their MBAs. We also have a course taught by an Indigenous professor of law, which is about how Indigenous law can inform present day decision making in Indigenous communities about business and other leadership issues. And that again is very different from anything you'd see in a regular MBA. Yeah. But most of the other courses, you think, well, accounting is accounting, whether it's run by Indigenous people or not. But there's still there's still important differences because the way we teach accounting, we're trying to get people to understand how to manage the accounting function in an organization. Mm-hmm. And that accounting function may be quite different in an Indigenous community than it is in a corporation. Yeah. And so we help people think about, what ratios would be useful for Indigenous leaders in making decisions about their community, which would be different ratios than a corporation might use. So all of the courses get changed somewhat, but some of the courses are completely different. Mm-hmm. And the atmosphere in the class is very different. It's hard to put your finger on, but anyone who was taught in this program and taught in a regular EMBA program would agree that they're different, whether or not they can put their finger exactly on what the difference is. But I do think that the students in the program are more cooperative and less competitive, for one thing. Uh, the students have a more uneven educational background because we accept a lot of students in who don't have an undergraduate degree, and some of them who have no post-secondary education, but we accept them in on the basis of what they've accomplished in their lives. And so that also affects the nature of the conversation in the class. So anyway, it ends up being very different. Yeah. It's also, people don't who aren't familiar with working with Indigenous peoples may not get this right away, but I believe it's the most multicultural program we have in our faculty because we have people from many different Indigenous nations, even though they're all Canadians. Um, so they, so when people come in class and they talk about ceremony and they talk about the way things are that are done in their community, or even the worldview that their community holds, it's very comparative, right? People are bringing all their own backgrounds and relating those to the works that we study. So it is a tremendously rich cultural experience for everybody. Well, we look for people who have 10 years of business experience or leadership experience. So we don't take many people under 30. Once in a while we do if we've got somebody who's really demonstrated leadership and has good academic qualifications, but most of our students are between 30 and 65. Um, and most of them are in their 40s. Uh, so, well, they bring a lot of experience to the classroom. Well, on the surface of it, the program looks like it's designed to bring skills that have not been available to Indigenous leaders. Um, but that only begins to scratch the surface of it, because um, most Indigenous people, at least most of the ones who apply to our program, don't want to do business the same way that every other business operates. They have a strong sense of identity, and they want their involvement in business or their other organizations. Many of them are not in business organizations. They want their involvement to reflect who they are, their values, their identity, and so on. So I believe that we are creating a group of people who are actually thinking about what Indigenous business should be, that is not just everyday business done by Indigenous people. Um, so, some Indigenous people probably think that going into a business program is a sellout. It's going over to the Western way of doing things. But I believe that this kind of program actually helps people be more Indigenous in many respects, because the experience of studying with a group of other Indigenous students reinforces people's sense of identity, reinforces the sense that Indigenous people can take their traditional values and be creative and forward thinking without losing who they are or becoming apples, as the expression is, and red on the outside, white on the inside. So I believe that over time we will see new kinds of business that are developed by Indigenous people, and that some of those will be models that other people will want to emulate and learn from. So I have very high aspirations for what the program is part of. Obviously, it couldn't exist except for the fact that the relationship between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people in Canada is changing, and this is part of the change. There are many ways in which this program uh, is an instantiation of excellence with regard to Indigenous programming, I think. Some were there from the start, in that the program was designed because I was lucky enough to be working with a bunch of Indigenous leaders, and I listened to them and based thinking about the program on what I learned from them. And I involved one Indigenous leader in particular I had worked with on other projects, whose name is Dr. Michelle Corfield. I involved her in the design of the program, so that it would be an Indigenous program, not just a program for Indigenous people. Um, then, of course, we had to listen to students from the beginning, because the first students who came in were skeptical. They thought, am I in the right program? Is this really going to be geared to my interests? Or is this just wallpaper, right? Is this just a commercial ploy by a university to get money from Aboriginal people? Um, so we had to take those things seriously, and we've continued to learn from them. I believe that the cohort model is really important. I believe that the fact that we have a unique schedule is actually very important, and people always underestimate the importance of schedule for educational programs, but it allows people from across Canada to come here and take this program without losing touch with their communities if they live in the community, and while continuing their employment, which makes it possible for more people. So that, I think, is a feature of excellence. I'm retiring in part so that the program can be run by an Indigenous leader, and that's happening. So we have a new person coming in as director of the program, and she is Indigenous, and her staff is Indigenous, and that will continue to develop the unique characteristics of the program in a way that wouldn't happen if it was run by a person who wasn't Indigenous, even if their heart was in the right place. So I think all those are important factors. Um, there are probably more, but I think that those are critical factors. I think the cohort model is one thing that's extremely important and hasn't been thought through enough for other programs. I have a background in educational theory and measurement. And it's totally irrelevant to how I actually evaluate the success of this program. So the success of the program for me is watching the graduates of the program do things. So you may be aware of the fact that the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people have bought real estate in the Greater Vancouver area um, over the last 2 or 3 years, and they've done it together, which is a total break from the way they had been working before, where they were each claiming land and then fighting each other in court to see who got it. Well, they now have literally billions of dollars worth of real estate, and one of the reasons why it happened is because of one of the students in our program who started to learn about corporate governance and Indigenous governance and how they were related, and started to paint a picture of how the three nations could work together in a way that was effective. So um, that's one example. Another is there's a daycare center that's being built in Terrace right now. It was built because a student who was the executive director of a friendship center in Terrace wrote his graduating project for his program on the idea of a child care center of this type in Terrace, and they got the funding for it as a result of being able to articulate what they were looking for and to convince other stakeholders to join in with them. We have a member of parliament from the program who's not Indigenous but studied in the program with Indigenous students. She understands Indigenous issues in a way that she never would have otherwise, even though she had some background in working with Indigenous peoples before. Um, and and she takes that to the cabinet table. Uh, we've got other people in very senior positions. One guy who is incredibly business-oriented leader, very successful construction company, retail development. Um, he was doing very well, and yet his picture of what it was to be an Indigenous leader was expanded greatly. So he saw, by the end of the program, he saw that running a successful business wasn't all that he cared about, and he ended up writing a project about how the more successful nations could share their wealth and knowledge with less successful nations. And he's been involved in areas of government policy that are totally fundamental to Canada moving forward in this area. So, I mean, I could go on, but there's, the individual students are out there changing the world, as I put it earlier, and they're changing the world in part because they've got the skills and the network and the confidence and the validation that comes with having an advanced degree. Um, and so um, that's how I measure success of the program. The success rate of students in the program, especially the ones who come in with less than an undergraduate degree, and how they succeed in the program, that's one measure that's important for me. But the real measure is seeing what people do with it. And I see a lot of people doing a lot of special things, and I believe that the program has played more than a small part for many of them in their capacity to be successful in those different roles they're playing. In reference to the particular programs that I've been interested in, it's taking topics that are often taught for other audiences, but making them Indigenous. So, you know, business, business in mainstream communities, if I can use that expression, is one thing. Business in Indigenous communities is another. And there's not much point in teaching Indigenous people about Western approaches to business only. It's counterproductive in some ways, and it's likely to lead people to leave their communities to work in non-Indigenous businesses, even if it's successful. But many of the people I've met, the people I care about, want to take what they can from Western business, but they want to live it in an Indigenous way. And the only way that's going to happen is if we develop programs that are responsive to the context in which Indigenous people are living, and programs that start to reflect the values of Indigenous people in the way that they're taught and designed. Our program is 5 years old. We already have two groups of Aboriginal leaders who have been through the program and graduated and are out there changing the world. Uh, I believe that a network of Indigenous leaders who share this kind of background will be a very powerful force. And so building that network to a level of critical mass, 100 or 200 would be much better than the current 50 or so that we have. So that that that's really my goal, is to have a number of Indigenous leaders in many different walks of life who have more background in areas like financial management and economics, but also um, ethics and epistemology, marketing, strategy, people who share a sort of broad background in business skills, participating in a variety of organizations and communicating across the different barriers that separate Indigenous people all too often.
Yeah.
So that would be, from one nation to another, from one walk of life or profession to another, um, because that's where progress is going to happen.
Great.
There's a sort of corollary benefit, and that is by having groups of Indigenous students studying in our business school, it begins to change the business school. So the people who teach in that program start to realize how capable and important Indigenous business, how capable Indigenous people are, and how important Indigenous business is. And now we have many of the other MBA programs asking to have Indigenous content introduced into those programs, which is fundamentally important, because when I talk to business leaders, they say that the biggest single issue that they spend time on, as in their executive teams, is on Indigenous relations. And yet, very few of them have any training or formal instruction in this area. And so, hopefully, we will not only create opportunities for networking among Indigenous leaders who have a strong set of skills, but we'll also start to change the way people think about business education to include Indigenous relations as a major topic. At this point, there is very little high quality, advanced level research done on Indigenous business in Canada. And it's really broader than that, because it includes Indigenous governance, which is, you don't have Indigenous business success without strong Indigenous governance, uh, at least not within nations. So um, having better research is an important set of information that we need. Um, I know there's a lot of talk about indigenization and so on, and some people focus a lot on that. I think it may be important for the rest of the university. Um, I think if you build cohort programs like ours, where the majority of the students in the program are Indigenous, um, all that pretty much takes care of itself, because we have mature individuals. They've been chiefs, elected chiefs, some hereditary chiefs. They've run Aboriginal organizations. They've been band managers. Um, when they come in, they're not. They're going to influence the business school as much as the business school is going to influence them. So our program ends up having a lot of Indigenous content and reflecting Indigenous values just by virtue of the students in the program. And after they've been together for a year or more, then they start to influence the faculty members who teach them as much as the faculty members influence them. So indigenization isn't so much of an issue if you think about it in the kinds of programming that we do. But I think it is in many other contexts. Um, I do think that the whole idea of having cohorts of Indigenous students studying together is underdeveloped, and I think it's really important because our success rates are very good. Um, Up 75 or 80% of our students graduate in the expected amount of time, which is better than the performance of Indigenous students across the board in universities, many of whom start university don't find it very congenial and leave. So, but I believe if we had more cohort programs, we would have more success of Indigenous students in the university. But that's certainly true at the graduate level in the kind of professional program that we've developed. But I think it could be adapted to be used at the undergraduate level and in other professional schools.